Russia's internal security system is cracking, not at the border, not on the battlefield. Inside the state itself, units responsible for maintaining order are facing delayed salaries, vanished bonuses, and pay that inflation has reduced to almost nothing. In multiple regions, security personnel have begun refusing deployments, requesting transfers, or quietly walking away from posts they once competed to hold. This isn't theoretical. We've already seen what happens when pressure reaches this point. There was a moment not long ago when an armed column moved toward Moscow, and the system didn't stop it. Roadblocks were abandoned. Air defenses stayed silent. The state's own security system hesitated, and that hesitation was never explained. That moment exposed a truth the Kremlin never addressed. Loyalty in Russia's security apparatus isn't ideological, it's transactional. Today, that transaction is failing. Reports of unpaid or delayed salaries inside Rosgvardia and internal police units are growing. Hazard pay has disappeared. Overtime goes unpaid. Inflation eats what remains. On paper, wages still exist. In practice, many guards are being asked to enforce order without being compensated for it. And when the people tasked with suppressing unrest can't rely on the state to pay them, enforcement becomes selective. This isn't open revolt. It's something more dangerous. It's disengagement. Because when a government can't pay its own guards, the question isn't whether unrest is coming. It's who will still respond when it does. What's happening now isn't loud. It isn't announced. And it isn't uniform. It begins with payroll. Across Russia, internal security units are still deployed, still uniformed, still visible, but the system paying them is slipping out of sync. Salaries arrive late. Bonuses quietly disappear. Hazard pay becomes inconsistent. Inflation finishes the job. This isn't unique. This pattern has appeared before, not as a crisis, but as a warning phase. In past moments of pressure, delayed pay inside enforcement structures didn't trigger revolt. It triggered something quieter. Units stayed in place, shifts were covered, but initiative vanished. That's exactly where things are now. Because internal security doesn't run on ideology, it runs on reliability. When guards stop trusting the calendar when they don't know when or how much they'll be paid, behavior shifts before orders do. The first change isn't refusal, it's hesitation. Assignments are questioned. Overtime is avoided. Transfers are requested not for political reasons, but because uncertainty spreads unevenly. This unevenness matters. Some regions still pay on time, others don't. And once that imbalance appears, a familiar cascade begins. Units in better funded regions stay responsive. Units in weaker regions slow down. Orders are followed selectively, not rejected, just delayed. This isn't disobedience, it's triage, not by command, by arithmetic. At the same time, internal workloads increase. More labor disputes linked to wage arrears. More infrastructure stress, as utilities fail intermittently. More fuel-related disruptions. More local protests that need monitoring. This combination has appeared before in other stress systems. When enforcement is asked to do more while being paid less, pressure doesn't explode outward. It implodes inward, because security forces don't just enforce order, they absorb pressure. And when pressure exceeds compensation, absorption stops. What replaces it isn't rebellion, it's minimal compliance. Presence without initiative, patrols without intervention, reports without follow-through. From the outside, everything still looks normal. Uniforms are worn. Vehicles move, orders are issued, but inside the system, confidence drains. And once confidence drains, coordination weakens. One department prioritizes crowd control. Another focuses on protecting critical assets. A third quietly limits exposure to unpredictable situations. No one says no. They just stop saying yes at the same speed. This is where civil unrest becomes harder to manage, not because crowds are larger, but because response timing slips. A protest that once would have been dispersed quickly is now observed. A labor strike that once would have been contained is now negotiated. A disruption that once would have triggered escalation is now tolerated temporarily. Temporary tolerance has consequences, because temporary becomes habitual. And habit becomes policy without ever being written. This is the danger zone. Once internal security adapts downward, reversing that behavior becomes extremely difficult. Not because orders don't exist, but because urgency can't be commanded back into a system that has learned caution. You can order loyalty, you can't order urgency. And the longer guards operate in a system where effort isn't rewarded predictably, the more enforcement turns reactive instead of preventive. At that point, unrest doesn't need to grow. It just needs time. What makes this moment especially unstable isn't anger, it's exhaustion. Across multiple regions, guards are still showing up not because they're paid reliably, but because the system hasn't formally collapsed yet. Shifts are covered, posts are manned, orders are acknowledged, but the transaction underneath it all is broken. Work continues without certainty of pay, sometimes without pay at all. This stage has appeared before in other pressure cycles. It's the phase where systems still function, but only because people haven't stopped yet. That changes everything. When people work without salary, they don't stop immediately. They stop caring incrementally. They stop volunteering for extra duty. They stop stepping into uncertain situations. They stop absorbing risk on behalf of the state. And security work is nothing but risk. Crowd control requires decisiveness. Patrols require initiative. Containment requires confidence that the institution will protect you afterward. Right now, many guards aren't sure it will, because pay delays don't arrive with explanations. They arrive with silence. A missing bonus one month becomes expected the next. Delayed hazard pay becomes normalized. Eventually, the paycheck stops being something you count on and starts being something you hope for. That psychological shift has consequences, because a guard who doesn't trust payroll cannot be expected to enforce trust in the streets. This is where unpredictability enters. What comes next rarely looks dramatic at first. The next failure won't arrive with slogans or gunfire. It will arrive as a scheduling error, a delayed payroll file, a regional transfer that clears partially or not at all, a unit told to stand by because overtime authorization hasn't come through. This is where risk concentrates. Because enforcement doesn't collapse through refusal, it collapses through absence. A patrol that never arrives, a response team reassigned at the last minute, backup that exists on paper but not on the street. At first, nothing explodes, but people notice patterns faster than states do. If one protest isn't dispersed, it becomes reference. If two are tolerated, it becomes expectation. If three last overnight, it becomes strategy. At that point, unrest no longer needs leadership. It only needs confirmation. The most likely future isn't a nationwide breakdown. It's a series of local incidents that stretch longer than expected, followed by slower responses, followed by quieter reporting. Nothing spectacular, nothing headline-worthy, until timing overlaps. A protest meets a holiday, a strike meets a fuel delay, a delayed response meets public expectation. That's when hesitation stops being abstract. It starts showing up on the street. A protest forms. Normally, it would be dispersed quickly. Now, response time stretches. Orders move slower through the chain. Supervisors hesitate before committing manpower, not because they oppose the order, but because committing means responsibility without compensation. And when enforcement becomes cautious, crowds sense it. Not consciously, instinctively. They notice when lines hold but don't advance. When warnings are issued but not enforced. When authority is present but restrained, that's when tension builds. This is the most unstable phase of civil order. Not when guards refuse outright, but when they show up uncertain whether they're being paid to intervene. Every deployment becomes a calculation. Is this worth the risk? Is backup guaranteed? Will overtime be compensated or ignored? Those questions don't stop unrest. They delay response. And delayed response turns small incidents into large ones. A labor protest blocks a road longer than expected. A local dispute spills into the evening. A crowd that should have dispersed stays, not because it's stronger, but because enforcement is weaker. This weakness doesn't announce itself. There are no statements, no refusals, no slogans, just a quiet recalibration where guards preserve themselves before they preserve order. This is where accidents happen, not planned violence, not organized rebellion, misjudgments. A unit arrives late. Another assumes someone else will intervene. A commander hesitates, waiting for confirmation that never comes. And once confusion enters a security response, outcomes become unpredictable. This is why unpaid enforcement is more dangerous than angry enforcement. Anger explodes, uncertainty drifts, and drift is harder to control. Because when people work without pay, they don't feel bound to outcomes. They feel bound to survival. They don't escalate. They withdraw. They don't confront. They contain themselves. And that creates a vacuum. Unrest doesn't need leadership to grow inside a vacuum. It just needs space. Right now, that space is forming not because guards are rebelling, but because they're being asked to enforce stability without being given stability themselves. The pressure doesn't spread evenly. Moscow still pays on time, still prioritizes its perimeter, still absorbs cost before allowing visible weakness. But the state isn't just Moscow. Beyond the capital, the math changes fast. Regional budgets are tighter, transfers arrive late, local authorities stretch payrolls quietly. That's where guards feel it first, not because they're less loyal, but because they're less protected. This is how systems fail at the edges, not with one spark, but with uneven response. And once enforcement becomes uneven, obedience follows. This is why issuing tougher orders doesn't fix the problem. Orders don't pay salaries. Decrees don't restore confidence. Threats don't compensate for risk. The system still functions, but conditionally, and conditional authority isn't authority at all. It's a countdown, not to rebellion, not to collapse, but to the moment when everyone, guards included, understands the rules no longer apply evenly. That's the shift worth watching. What happens when enforcement becomes optional and everyone knows it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you want to see these pressure points before they're acknowledged, like the video and subscribe. We don't track noise, we track stress. Stay alert. Thanks for watching.